February 14, 1943, at Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia, the first thin blade of sunlight cut across the rugged Atlas foothills, turning the ridgelines gold, while the valleys below still drowned in smoke. American M4 Sherman tanks rolled forward over hard peninsula and broken scrub, the cold air trembling with engine rumble. Inside each turret, crewmen adjusted their headsets and spoke into throat microphones strapped beneath their helmets. The voices that returned were calm, crisp, and astonishingly clear, slicing through the chaos of battle. Red 2, shift left enemy armor on the ridge. These were the unmistakable tones of frequency modulation, a brand new technology that allowed commanders to speak across the battlefield without static or distortion. Across the valley, hidden between shadowed folds of rock, German Panzer crews struggled to hear anything at all. Orders arrived late, faint, or incomprehensible. Their AM radio sets, once the pride of the Panzerwaffe, were now vulnerable to every burst of engine noise, every jolt of movement, every cannon blast. Some German tank commanders gave up entirely and switched to hand signals, desperate to coordinate against a numerically superior but inexperienced American force. As German shells tore into the rocky slopes and American gunners fought to steady their nerves, an invisible truth was already determining the outcome. One side could speak, the other side could only shout into static. This scene, repeated countless times between 1943 and 1945, revealed a secret advantage embedded deep inside every Sherman tank. An advantage rarely mentioned in post-war debates about armor thickness or gun caliber. An advantage that proved decisive even when Shermans faced the terrifying Tiger or the deadly Panther. It was the advantage of communication, of instant, reliable coordination, of shared awareness, of a unified will translated into movement. And it began in the deserts of North Africa, where the United States Army first learned how to fight a modern armored war. The early story of American FM radios is inseparable from the early story of American failure. The U.S. Army that landed in North Africa in late 1942 was inexperienced, untested, and often unprepared. Officers worried about logistics more than tactics. Many tank crews were still learning how to load a 75mm round without fumbling. And in vehicle-to-vehicle combat, American gunners lacked the finesse and calm that veteran German crews possessed. But the U.S. Army had something the Germans did not: extraordinary industrial foresight. Before the war, American engineers at Fort Monmouth and Signal Corps laboratories decided to take a gamble on the experimental concept of frequency modulation. Most militaries still relied on AM radio, which were simple and cheap but notoriously prone to static. FM was technically complex, required crystal-controlled stability, and had never been mass-produced for combat. But American planners believed that a tank force was only as strong as its ability to communicate. Even before the Sherman design was finalized, the decision was made. Every single tank would receive an FM set, no shortcuts, no compromise. By late 1942, the SCR 508 radio was installed in every new Sherman. It transmitted at 25 watts, enough to cut through interference at ranges up to 10 miles in ideal conditions. More importantly, FM modulation eliminated the thunderous static bursts that plagued AM radios whenever a nearby weapon fired. To a German tank commander, every exchange of fire created a blizzard of noise across the radio band. To an American commander, the battle grew louder, but the radio stayed quiet, calm, and perfectly intelligible. This difference, small, invisible, easily overlooked, laid the foundation for networked warfare. The SCR 508 radio assembly was mounted on shock absorbers in the turret bustle, protected from vibration and shrapnel. Inside the metal casing were rows of tubes carefully insulated to survive tank recoil. A simple selector allowed crews to switch between preset channels whose frequencies were controlled by quartz crystal. The effect was revolutionary. American tank units could establish platoon-level, company-level, and battalion-level nets that never needed recalibration under fire, and could be used by crews with minimal training. German radios, by contrast, often required crews to manually tune the dial while under fire, attempting to find a commander's voice amid shrieking static and battlefield noise. Even highly trained panzer crews struggled with this. And in the chaos of Tunisia, where dust and terrain disrupted line of sight, an unreliable radio was almost useless. By February 1943, the U.S. Army faced its first true test at the Kasserine Pass. Rommel, the Desert Fox, recognized the Americans' inexperience and exploited it mercilessly. German armored units struck with precision at weak points in the American line, collapsing positions and forcing retreats. But even as Sherman crews reeled under the assault, a remarkable pattern emerged. Units that kept their radios functional reacted faster, maneuvered more effectively, and survived in greater numbers than those that did not. Officers noticed that platoons with strong internal communication held their ground or retreated in good order, while others scattered. Red 2, shift left. Red 3, hold your fire. Red 5, move to support the ridge. Across the valley, German radio screamed nothing but noise. The U.S. Army lost the battle, but in losing, it learned. Reports poured into headquarters noting the surprising reliability of American radios and their impact on tactical cohesion. Officers recommended expanding radio protocols, improving voice discipline, and integrating armored radios with artillery net. Within months, these ideas became standard practice. Meanwhile, German commanders produced equally revealing reports. They wrote of units cut off, unable to coordinate, unable to mass force at critical moments. One officer described platoons fighting as individual tanks rather than as a unit. Another lamented losing his command tank early in a firefight and thus losing all ability to direct the company. Rommel himself repeatedly complained of radio outages during crucial assaults. These observations illustrate a crucial truth. The U.S. Army entered Tunisia unprepared but left with a tactical doctrine shaped around communication. The Panzerwaffe entered Tunisia as armored masters but left with their greatest weakness exposed. American industrial capacity exceeded mere steel production. It delivered reliable, standardized electronics in quantities Germany could never match. Factories in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Illinois produced -508 Seychelles rupees sets in tens of thousands, each identical, each ruggedized, each ready for immediate. Replacement parts were interchangeable from tank to tank. Training manuals were standardized. Repair kits were universal. This homogeneity created a battlefield language that every American tanker could speak. German radios were produced in smaller quantities at decentralized factories using inconsistent components. Field repairs were improvisational. Replacement parts were not always compatible. Many panzer crews cannibalized radios from damaged tanks just to remain operational. And once the Allies began bombing German factories, even that became difficult. Inside the Sherman turret, the crew lived in brutal conditions. Temperatures soared. The smell of gasoline, oil, and burnt cordite filled the air. The metallic vibrations of the engine shook every bone. Yet when a commander pressed the transmit switch, he entered a world of clarity. White 1 to White 2 enemy movement north of the Wadi. The voice of a fellow tanker, calm amid the storm, represented more than tactical information. It represented connection, belonging, the knowledge that they fought not alone, but as part of something larger. German tankers wrote of the opposite feeling. Many described the loneliness they felt when their radios failed. The Tiger I, revered for its firepower, often fought without knowing where Allied tanks were, whether infantry support was arriving, or whether artillery had been called. Otto Carius, one of the most respected Tiger commanders, recounted moments where confusion reigned simply because no one could communicate clearly. On the battlefield, a tank without a radio might as well have been blind. The Tiger I's mechanical prowess was meaningless without coordination. A Tiger could destroy multiple Shermans, sometimes at ranges where the Americans could not return fire effectively. But Shermans did not fight as individuals. They fought as teams of 5, 10, or 20 tanks, supported by infantry, guided by artillery, coordinated by radio. One Sherman suppressed the Tiger, another maneuvered, another called for support. The Tiger often faced not a single enemy, but an entire invisible network. After Tunisia, the U.S. Army advanced into Sicily in July 1943. The terrain favored defenders' steep slope, narrow roads, ridges ideal for German armor and anti-tank guns inflicted heavy losses. But American tanks did something unexpected. They shifted entire axes of attack within minutes. Communications allowed battalion commanders to redirect units under fire, adjust route, and flank German positions that believed the terrain protected them. German after-action reports spoke of American tanks appearing from nowhere or maneuvering faster than expected. In reality, the Americans were not faster, they were coordinated. Every Sherman on the battlefield was part of a real-time information network. By the time the Allies landed at Salerno, in Italy, American radio doctrine was fully developed. Shermans served not just as fighting vehicles but as mobile command nodes. Commanders used FM radios to integrate artillery barrages, call air support, reposition infantry, and deliver updates to headquarters. Germans often fought reactively, responding to threats only when they appeared in their optic. Americans fought proactively, adjusting their maneuver before threats materialized. As the U.S. Army advanced slowly up the Italian peninsula, fighting through mud, rain, mountain passes, and fortified positions, the radio became the glue linking every component of the combined arms strategy. Opposition from German units was fierce, particularly from armored divisions equipped with heavy tanks. Yet again, communication shaped outcome. At Monte Cassino, tank movements were hindered by terrain, rubble, and mines, but Shermans used radios to coordinate closely with infantry navigating the ruin. When infantry spotted a German position, they relayed directly to supporting armor. When armor needed smoke cover or artillery suppression, they called it instantly. German defenders often did not know where American tanks were or even if they were still operational because their own communications networks had broken down under the strain of continuous bombardment. This pattern would repeat across Italy. Coordinated American movement overcoming superior German battlefield positions through superior communication. Mini cliffhanger. And all of this Tunisia, Sicily, Salerno was only the beginning. The true test would come in France, in the labyrinth of hedgerows that turned Normandy into a murder maze, where visibility dropped to mere feet and radios became the only form of sight. By June 1944, the Allied invasion of France was underway, and the U.S. Army faced the deadliest terrain imaginable for armored warfare. The bocage, centuries-old hedgerows, thick as walls and twice as unforgiving, carved the countryside into a maze of narrow fields and ambush corridors. Visibility collapsed to mere meters. Tank duels occurred at point-blank range. German Panther crews, lying in wait with guns dialed into devastating accuracy, could destroy a Sherman before its commander knew where the shot came from. On paper, this should have been a slaughter. The Panther was designed for this kind of environment. Its long-barreled 75mm cannon could punch through a Sherman front plate long before the Americans could return effective fire. The German crews were veterans, confident, and often camouflaged to perfection among the hedgerows. And yet, again and again, American units survived ambushes, regrouped faster than expected, and counterattacked from multiple angles with uncanny coordination. This was not luck, it was FM radio discipline. When a Sherman took fire, the surviving tanks instantly knew. The commander pressed his throat mic and delivered calm, precise update. Contact front. Panther in the east hedgerow. Blue 2, flanked through the orchard. Blue 4, smoked the lane. Within seconds, adjacent platoons altered course. Infantry in the next field heard the report through their own wired nets and shifted position. Artillery captains miles away adjusted fire based on coordinates delivered directly from the tank commander's voice. A Panther firing from concealment might destroy one Sherman, but before it could relocate, American units had already encircled it with coordinated fire lane. German tankers often found themselves trapped by invisible forces, artillery, smoke, infantry, and armor all converging with frightening speed. The Panther's superior firepower meant little when its crew didn't know who was approaching, from where, or how many. German after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly referred to American armor as fluid, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. These descriptions had little to do with mechanical mobility and everything to do with real-time communication. In one engagement near Saint-Lay, a panzer commander described attempting to direct his company into a defensive spread, but two of his platoons never received the order. One had its radio antenna snapped by shrapnel. The other had been drowned out by static during a firefight. As he tried to reposition his remaining units, American tanks and infantry were already maneuvering based on updated reconnaissance. "We were fighting ghosts," he wrote. "They always knew more than we did." The bocage forced American units to refine their radio doctrine further. Crews developed shorthand signals and voice procedures for moving through tight corridors. Tank commanders began calling themselves blind men with long arms, unable to see far, but able to reach across the battlefield with their radio. They trusted the voices more than their own eyes. This was a profound shift. Vision had become auditory. Meanwhile, German forces had to rely on runner, hand signals, and prearranged flares, methods that became suicidal once American artillery focused on any known gathering point. A Panther might hold a hedgerow corner with lethal efficiency, but without radio guidance it had no idea if friendly units were retreating, advancing, or dead. The Germans were learning the same lesson the Americans had learned in Tunisia. Isolation kills. As July progressed, the Allied breakout plan gained momentum. Operation Cobra, scheduled for July 25th, aimed to smash a hole in the German lines west of Saint-Lay and unleash American armored divisions into open country. The plan required coordination on a scale no previous Allied armored operation had attempted. Bombers, artillery, infantry, tank destroyers, reconnaissance units, and armored columns were all synchronized through a network of radio nets built around FM clarity. The morning of Cobra began with one of the most brutal bombardments of the war. Over 3,000 aircraft shredded the German front, throwing up a blinding curtain of dust and debris that turned the battlefield into a swirling brown haze. Visibility dropped to near zero. German defenders, stunned and shaking, found themselves choking on dust, unable to see 10 feet ahead, and in that chaos, American Shermans advanced. Tank commanders now fought almost entirely by radio. White 1 moving, White to follow, White 3 hold until dust clear. Infantry on your right flank, inside the swirling haze. platoons maintained precise distances and fire arcs by voice alone. Radio discipline allowed tanks to avoid collision, coordinate fire lanes, and push through gaps without ever seeing the units on their left or right. German accounts describe Shermans emerging from the dust like phantoms, appearing, firing, and disappearing before defenders could respond. One German sergeant wrote that American armor seemed to flow along the ground without hesitation. The American advance wasn't fast, it was synchronized. In a haze where eyesight meant nothing, communication meant everything. Once American units broke through, the FM radios proved even more decisive. Tank battalions accelerated into open terrain, spreading across wide fronts in pursuit of retreating German forces. German commanders attempted to form new defensive lines, but their AM radios failed repeatedly under the stress of movement, cross-frequency interference, and mechanical damage. Many units couldn't even confirm whether neighboring companies were still intact. A Panther that withdrew temporarily was often functionally lost, unable to rejoin the fight until regrouped by chance. Meanwhile, Shermans were directed like chess pieces. Red company, swing to miles west. Blue company, push toward Coutances. Yellow platoon, intercept enemy vehicles near the crossroad. They were not simply driving forward, they were hunting with coordination born of constant information flow. This expansion into operational level radio warfare demonstrated something profound. American tanks didn't need to win every duel. They needed to win the network. They needed to be part of a larger, flexible system that used information to outmaneuver even the strongest opponent. And the Germans, despite their lethal machines, increasingly fought as fragmented survivors of a collapsing communications ecosystem. As the Allies drove across France, the German army attempted counterattacks with armored units that were shadows of their former blitzkrieg glory. In August 1944, at Mortain, German Panzer divisions launched Operation Latitude, a desperate attempt to cut through American lines and reach Franches. It was a bold plan, relying on concentrated armored force. But concentration meant nothing without coordination. German radios were overwhelmed by static, faulty equipment, and the simple distances involved. Many units advanced without knowing neighboring units had been delayed or destroyed. Attacking Panthers sometimes drove into American roadblocks not because of bad tactics but because no one had told them the plan had changed. A Tiger commander recalled halting at the edge of a village and waiting for supporting armor that never appeared, unaware those units had been destroyed hours earlier. American units, meanwhile, responded with radio-driven precision. Artillery batteries were directed by forward observers riding in Sherman. Tank destroyers shifted positions based on real-time update. Infantry units redeployed within minutes. Mortain became the first major armored battle where German communications failed so completely that their attack collapsed even before superior American firepower arrived. As the American armies approached Paris and the German forces retreated toward the Seine, the panzer divisions fell into increasing disarray. Radios failed during marches. Antennas snapped. Replacement parts were non-existent. Fuel shortages forced units to abandon tanks that might have served as crucial communication nodes if only they had been operable. One German officer wrote bitterly, "We fought not with tanks, but with silhouettes. We had machines of steel but nerves of frayed wire." When the U.S. Army crossed into Belgium and approached the German frontier, they carried with them lessons forged in the desert, refined in Italy, and perfected in Normandy. These lessons would be tested in the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army, the Ardennes Offensive. In December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise attack through the densely forested Ardennes region, igniting the Battle of the Bulge. Snow blanketed the ground. Ice coated the road. Fog and blizzards reduced visibility to almost nothing. German units used the weather to their advantage. Allied air support grounded, reconnaissance planes silent. But weather that crippled air power also crippled AM radio. German communications, already stressed, deteriorated rapidly. Snow and ice on antennas dampened signal strength. Fog and humidity distorted frequencies. Some radios froze mechanically. Units often fought entirely blind, guided only by pre-planned objectives that quickly lost relevance as the situation shifted. American FM radios, surprisingly, held firm. Snowfall dampened noise, but FM modulation resisted interference better than expected. As long as crews kept their antennas clear of ice, communications remained steady. This alone proved decisive. Tank crews in Shermans patrolled Forest Road, their only vision the faint outlines of trees in the gloom. Yet they navigated with confidence. Keep to the right, Fort. Enemy armor reported for miles east. Roadblock ahead. Voices guided armored columns through a landscape that resembled a sensory deprivation chamber. American commanders often had more situational awareness in blizzard conditions than German officers had on clear days. When German armored spearheads struck at towns like St. Vith and Bastogne, they hoped rapid armored penetration would break American lines cleanly. But American radio networks allowed defenders to rally, reposition, and reinforced faster than the Germans anticipated. Units sprang from seemingly impossible angles, arriving in minutes because they had been guided by constant update. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, American forces used their radios to coordinate defenses, call artillery fire, and relay German movement. German units encircling the town often had no idea how many defenders remained, where they were positioned, or whether reinforcements had arrived. When General McAuliffe sent his famous one-word reply, "Nuts," he sent it through a courier, but the tactical resilience of his men depended almost entirely on the FM nets humming beneath the snow. As the German offensive stalled and American forces counterattacked, radio-driven mobility again proved decisive. Sherman units struck flanks, cut supply routes, and isolated German pockets. Panthers and Tigers fought fiercely in the snowy woods but often lacked knowledge of friendly position. Many German veterans described fighting alone, not in platoons but as single tanks trapped in forests filled with unseen enemies. A Tiger commander later wrote, "It was like fighting with a blindfold. We could not see the battlefield. The Americans could hear it." And so, as the Ardennes thawed and Germany braced for the final onslaught, the stage was set for the last and largest demonstration of American networked armored warfare, the crossing of the Rhine. As winter eased into March 1945, the Rhine River stood as Germany's last major natural barrier. The Allies needed to coordinate engineers, infantry, artillery, tanks, bridging crews, air support, and logistics across dozens of miles. This required a level of communication that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. American armored units, now veterans of multiple campaigns, used their radios as seamlessly as they used their weapons. Engineers reported bridge progress directly to tank commanders. Recon cars relayed German movements instantly. Infantry leaders called for armored support without delay. Artillery fire missions flowed like water along the neck. German defenders attempted last-ditch armored counterattacks, but their efforts resembled isolated punches rather than coordinated blows. Panthers struck with determination but without support. Tigers attacked into ambushes unknowing. Many German crews did not realize when neighboring units had been destroyed. American units, by contrast, pivoted entire battalions in minutes. One battalion executed a 90-degree directional change under fire, something unthinkable without radio coordination. And here, at the gates of Germany, the pattern that had begun at Kasserine reached its final, unmistakable conclusion. Information had become the decisive weapon of the armored battlefield. As the Americans surged eastward, German collapse accelerated. Radios failed, fuel ran out, supply lines shattered. Some panzer crews abandoned their tanks not from cowardice but because they could no longer communicate. A tank without a radio was a coffin waiting to be sealed. Yet amid this collapse, the human experience remained the core of armored warfare. Near Remagen, one American commander recalled believing his platoon had been cut off. Snow fell, the bridge had trembled, and the enemy approached. But then a voice crackled through the headset, calm, steady, "We're with you, Blue Sick," coming from the north. In that moment, he later said, the radio felt like a hand on his shoulder. German survivors spoke of a different feeling. The quiet terror of hearing nothing but the hum of the engine and the creaking of ice. "We fought only with our eyes," one Panther commander recalled. "It was a silent death." And so the final chapters of the war unfolded, with one army connected and another unraveling. As the Rhine crossings widened and American armored divisions poured into Germany, the difference in communication infrastructure between the two armies became starkly visible. German tank units, deprived of reliable radios, often fought in isolated pockets. Their once formidable armored doctrine dissolved into scattered, uncoordinated action, each unit acting on incomplete information, each commander seeing only the narrow frame of battle through his periscope. Meanwhile, American Shermans by the thousands moved like interconnected nodes in a vast, humming network. Every commander heard the same information at nearly the same moment. Every platoon could adjust its movements based on updates from scouts miles away. Every misstep was corrected in real time. Every opportunity exploited before the Germans even recognized it. For German tank commanders, the collapse of communication meant the collapse of doctrine itself. The foundational principle of blitzkrieg, fast, decisive movement based on shared intelligence, simply no longer exists. German high command sent out orders that never reached the front, or reached too late to matter. Panther crews waited in ambush for friendly units that had already been destroyed. Tigers counterattacked alone because no one could tell them reinforcements had been delayed. Even elite formations, such as the Panzer Lehr Division or the 2nd SS Panzer, found themselves unable to coordinate beyond company level. In one documented engagement near the town of Wessel, a German tank company attempted a night counterattack against an American bridgehead. Their orders were clear on paper: strike fast, use darkness for concealment, hit American armor before their engineers established defensive position. But within minutes of advancing, the lead Panther lost its radio entirely. After a jolt snapped the brittle antenna base. Two other tanks, attempting to maintain formation, drifted into the wrong road. A fourth, receiving only broken transmissions through static, halted and waited for instructions that never came. By the time the remaining tanks reached the outskirts of the American position, they faced coordinated fire from multiple directions, a trap orchestrated not by superior American armor, but by synchronized American radio. Shermans coordinated movements with infantry and artillery. They adjusted angles, shifted fire lane, and blocked escape routes. They operated as a unified whole. The Panther crews, by contrast, had fought not a network, but an organism, a machine of many eyes and many voices. Outnumbered and without support, the German counterattack collapsed in minutes. Survivors later wrote that they entered darkness as a company but fought as individuals. The closer the Allies came to the German heartland, the more acute these disparities became. Fuel shortages ravaged German armored units. Many tanks could barely drive a few miles before sputtering to a halt. But even those with fuel suffered from another scarcity: working radio components. American armored division, with their vast logistics infrastructure, replaced broken SCR-508 sets within hours. Spare parts were abundant. Training manuals were universal. Every tank battalion had communication specialists on hand. If a radio failed, the crew could repair it quickly or swap it out entirely. German crews had no such luxury. Radio components were scarce. Repairs were improvised. Tubes were salvaged from wrecks. Wires were patched using whatever material was at hand. Many tankers were forced to share radios between vehicles. Others fought with only receivers, unable to transmit. Some had radios but no power supply. Some had radios that technically worked but were rendered useless by snow, rain, or corrupted frequencies. The disparity was not merely technological, it was structural. American industry produced radios with the same relentless skill and standardization as it produced tanks, trucks, and rifles. German industry, fractured by shortages and bombings, could not keep pace. The result was a modernized armored force fighting a pre-modern communications war. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, Sherman units increasingly acted as reconnaissance by force. They probed towns, forests, and hills, then relayed immediate intel to following units. A Sherman platoon entering a village might encounter scattered resistance machine gun fire from an upper floor, a concealed anti-tank gun, a Panther lurking at a crossroad. Within seconds, these observations were transmitted to supporting units, which adjusted approach routes or called artillery to neutralize threats. In one such engagement near Remscheid, American tanks encountered a Tiger and Panther whose first shot destroyed the lead Sherman. In earlier phases of the war, a single ambushing Panther could have halted an entire attack. But now, American FM radio networks allowed instantaneous adaptation. The surviving Shermans backed off, called for smoke, flanked through side streets, and brought in infantry with bazookas from the rear. The Panther crew, unable to warn neighboring units or call for support, fought alone. Within minutes, they were outmaneuvered and destroyed. This was the defining contrast of late war armored combat. The Panther had the gun, the armor, the optics, but the Sherman had the connection. The endgame of the war brought this truth into sharp relief during the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, the industrial heartland of Germany and the final refuge of many veteran Panzer units. Here, cut off from the rest of the front, German armor attempted desperate breakout attempts, but with radios failing, fuel exhausted, and command structures fractured, their assaults resembled disorganized charges rather than coordinated operations. Panthers and Tigers that might have been devastating in defensive ambush now found themselves driving blindly into American kill zones. Sherman units, supported by M10 and M36 tank destroyers, used their radios to coordinate overlapping fire arcs, trapping German tanks in crossfire. A Tiger might break through one American line, only to be reported instantly to another a mile away. Platoons reacted within seconds to new intelligence. German tankers, unable to communicate breakthroughs or request reinforcements, often did not know whether their actions had succeeded or failed. Some German officers attempted to use civilian telephone lines to coordinate their forces. Some resorted to motorcycles, bicycles, or even runner. But the speed of modern mechanized warfare had left these methods far behind. A runner might take 20 minutes to deliver a message that American forces could distribute in 20 seconds. As the Ruhr pocket collapsed, German tank crews described a feeling of profound helplessness. "We had tanks," one wrote, "but no voice." Another said, "We had steel without will." Their machine, marvels of engineering, had become mute giants. Meanwhile, on the American side, the human dimension of radio warfare deepened. Shermans often fought alongside infantry, who relied on their tank radios as lifeline. Infantry leaders carried walkie-talkies that linked directly into armored nets. Engineers repairing bridges or clearing mines communicated their progress to tank commanders, who adjusted their movement speed accordingly. Forward air controllers riding in jeeps or half-tracks coordinated with fighter bombers overhead, relaying targets spotted from Sherman vantage point. The battlefield had become a symphony of information and the Sherman was its conductor. Despite its vulnerabilities, thin armor, gasoline engine, susceptibility to fire, the Sherman's greatest strength was its ability to transform isolated moments of combat into coordinated action. A single tank might be outgunned, but 10 tanks acting together could overwhelm even the strongest German unit. And when those 10 tanks were linked to artillery, infantry, engineers, and aircraft, they became a force multiplier of staggering power. German veterans repeatedly expressed bewilderment at how quickly American units reacted to threats. A German officer near Paderborn described an engagement where his company attempted to stage an ambush against an approaching American column. They positioned their Panthers in forest cover and waited. When the Americans appeared, the Germans opened fire, destroying the tanks immediately. But within moments, American artillery rained down with unnerving accuracy, suppressing the ambush before the Panthers could relocate. How did they know we were here? One German tanker asked. The answer was simple. A Sherman commander had reported the initial shots instantly, and American artillery had responded within minutes based on precise coordinates transmitted through radio channels. The final armored confrontations of the war underscored this imbalance. As the Americans advanced toward the Elbe River, German armor, now a patchwork of surviving Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, and even outdated Panzer II's, attempted defensive actions that would have been formidable had they been coordinated. Instead, they were fragmented. One tank might hold a crossroads bravely, while another fought a mile away, without knowing whether the line had held or collapsed. American armored divisions encountered these isolated German tanks with calm efficiency. Sherman spotted muzzle flashes or glimpse movement, transmitted it instantly, and encircled threats using flanking. Tank destroyers positioned themselves to exploit new angles. Infantry cleared buildings. Engineers laid smoke. Every arm of American warfare moved in harmony, conducted through FM clarity. By April 1945, German armored resistance had become sporadic. Many veteran commanders had been killed, captured, or cut off. But even at the end, individual German tank crews fought with extraordinary courage. Panthers made last stands at bridges, road junctions, and riverbank. Tigers dueled American columns even when hopelessly outnumbered. Yet again and again, coordination trumped bravado. A Tiger I dug in near Magdeburg reportedly destroyed 7 American vehicles before it was finally silenced by a coordinated combination of artillery, flanking fire, and infantry assault. The Tiger's commander later stated that he never knew how many American tanks faced him, or from which direction the next shot would come. It was like fighting an army of whispers, he said. We could never see them, but they always saw us. As American forces converged on Berlin from the west and Soviet armies approached from the east, the final remnants of German armored units were either destroyed or surrendered. Many surrendered with radios smashed either from earlier damage or deliberate destruction to prevent capture. Some crews burned their tanks, others abandoned them intact, walking away silently from machines that had carried them through years of war. At war's end, American military analysts studied the battlefield results. They compared tank duels, loss ratios, mechanical breakdown, and logistical failure. They examined armor thickness and gun penetration charts. They interviewed veterans from both sides, and what they found was striking. Despite being mechanically inferior in many respects, the Sherman had performed far better than expected, not because of firepower or armor, but because of communication. In after-action report, American commanders emphasized the critical important radio net. Tank battalions that maintained strong communication suffered fewer losses and inflicted more damage. Units that lost radios during engagements often became disorganized and vulnerable. German commanders echoed this analysis. Their reports lamented the collapse of communications networks, the scarcity of functional radios, and the inability to coordinate even basic maneuvers. One officer wrote, "Our tanks were lines, but lines without roars." Another noted that losing radio contact was the first step toward defeat. The strategic lesson was unmistakable. Battlefield networks outweigh individual platform superiority. A tank, no matter how well armored or how deadly its gun, is only as effective as the information it receives and transmits. A lone Tiger was a beast. A coordinated pack of Shermans was a system. In the post-war years, as military thinkers reflected on the conflict, this lesson became foundational. Modern doctrine across the world, whether American, Soviet, British, or later NATO, centered on the premise that communication multiplies combat power. Radios became standard not only in tanks but in every vehicle, every platoon, every aircraft, every artillery battery. The vision of warfare changed forever, and yet, beneath this strategic truth lies a quieter, more human one. The voice inside the turret, the whispered reassurance, the calm guidance under fire, the knowledge that someone else is out there, fighting alongside you. American tankers spoke of this connection long after the war ended. Those FM voices, they said, were not merely tools, they were companionship. They were courage. German tankers, too, remembered the silence, the static, the feeling of isolation when orders failed to arrive, the dread of driving a machine of steel through forests and towns without knowing whether anyone else remained alive nearby. From the dust of Kasserine to the snows of the Ardennes to the riverbanks of the Rhine, the story repeated itself. The Sherman prevailed not because it was invincible, but because it was connected. The FM radio inside its steel hull was not glamorous, not loud, not dramatic, but it was the most advanced armored communication system in the world, and it turned thousands of individual tanks into a single, coherent force. In the end, the war was won not by the thickest armor, nor the longest gun, nor the fastest machine, but by the clearest voice.